Thank you very much, Moderator. And I would also like to thank the Office of the Representative on the Freedom of the Media and her office for inviting me to make this presentation this afternoon. May I just begin by making just two quick observations, one of which I've already alluded to, and that is just to say two things about the sort of the prehistory of this kind of integration of journalists, professional journalists and non-professional journalists. The first is to the rather well-trodden process, at least in the United Kingdom, which I'm quite pleased to say still exists when I'm going back there at the weekend, of what are called letters to the editor. I mean, there has been a long tradition of people in any walk of life being able to have their views published every day in a very prominent place in the newspaper. Now, those of you that have done that find it extremely satisfying when you get it published and incredibly frustrating when you don't, because you have very little comeback, in fact none at all, and they also have a kind of editorial control over the length and placing of the letter. But one shouldn't forget that there has been, at least in our country, my country, a very long tradition of anyone being able to have their opinions included in a daily newspaper. So that's just one remark to show that this integration is not that new. The second is just to reinforce or to mention again what I alluded to this morning, and that is my great belief that the transformation which we are now speaking about as open journalism actually really started with freedom of information laws. As I said, I had the great good fortune to be asked by Article 19 to do a study trip in what we then fondly called the Baltic countries. Katrina, I don't think we're allowed to say that anymore. We can? All right, the Baltic countries. And I interviewed a lot of highly placed and significant and prominent investigative journalists to ask them what use they were making of it, what benefit they thought was going to come from it. And almost to a person, they were highly skeptical of freedom of information laws. And of course they would trot out the usual professional nostrums of, well, they don't work enough, or they don't work quickly enough, and therefore they're no use to us. But what I began to actually realize was there was a subtext. And the subtext was that they relied on their contact diaries, their contact books, their Rolodexes. They didn't need freedom of information laws because they went directly to the contacts that they had nurtured over the years that they had become, and they were investigative journalists. And even more than that, which led me to coin this horrible neologism, it's horrible in English, and it may be even worse in other languages, of disintermediation, that the media was being disinterred by freedom of information laws because they allowed individuals, anyone, and very often as in the UK, not even citizens or residents, to apply for information and either use it or to disclose it that they themselves got from the public authority without going through the media to disclose this information, which very often they found was not being disclosed in any case. So I think that there is an interesting point there. I'm not quite sure how far to press it, but I do think that there was this significant development well before the internet, in which people could engage in the access to public information utilizing FOI laws. And I give great credit to the FOI law movement globally for this transformation, which I think the internet has, of course, enhanced and facilitated. It's much more technically glib and apt and all the rest of it, but I don't think we should forget in the history of disintermediation the role of freedom of information laws. Geneva, I was asked to address the question, how can we apply ethical and professional standards to open journalism? So I will just throw out some points and questions. It's middle of Friday afternoon, and I think it's probably time that we all engaged even more than listen to us from the top table here. So I've said in the first point that we are moving, that this question invites us to move from the question of what is open journalism to the question of what is good open journalism. I would take it that any intervention of ethics, which, by the way, when I hear the word, I usually want to reach for my metaphorical gun. I kind of hate the word. And I don't even know what the difference between ethics and morals is. I just think ethics is it's a fancier word than morals. Or maybe people prefer Greek to Rome. I don't know, Greece to Rome. But anyway, I'm not terribly keen on the idea of ethics. But there we go. So I think you can take out of that what you will. So I think we're moving here from the question from what is the sort of the nature and the characteristics of open journalism to what is good open journalism, because I take it that there is some relationship between ethics or morals and a sort of high degree of professionalism to acting in some kind of either virtuous way or some kind of reflective way or some kind of non-self-interested way, considering other interests or other values or other people. So it's the move to good open journalism, and I think that's not an insignificant point. And of course, as I say, one cannot make any kind of coincidental connection or relationship between ethical and professional. I was kind of a bit surprised to see these two lumped into the question. The two seem to me to be possibly connected, but certainly different, and I wouldn't say that in any sense they are coincident. If we could just scroll down a bit, please, just so we bring up, make sure that question 2 is now more prominent. So, and again, just to disinter the question, I mean, how can we apply ethical and professional standards? How can we apply ethical and commercial professional standards? Who is the we? That's always going to be relevant. Who is the community of interest who engages in the conversation or the discussion? And that is a very complicated issue. The value, I suppose, of there being professional journalist codes and so on, at least of the traditional variety, is that at least somehow the community was relatively circumscribed. The minute you move to ethics, never mind professionalism, and then you move to open or good open journalism, as we've heard a million times today, and rightly so, this phenomenon is open to everyone, everywhere, and anywhere. So how are you going to get a sort of plausible, inclusive discussion as to what these standards or what these norms should be? So the we is, I think, something which shouldn't be lightly just overlooked as we are reciting the question. Now, in terms of sort of the more focused part of the presentation, I've looked very much at the issue of the sort of integration of non-professional journalists in the context of professional journalism, and it's not unimportant to note that the established media, at least in the UK, for example, the BBC, has now got a 10-year-old user-generated content unit where there's about 20 plus people working every day to take the hundreds and thousands of items which are sent to it, which do raise particular questions, which I will come to at the end towards the end of the presentation. But there's quite a degree of history here. Though this business of user-generated or citizen journalism, as it was also came to be called, is quite, in our sort of field, quite ancient. At least 10 years old. And The Guardian, which is very much through the presence of Alan Rusbridger, its editor, been an enormous proponent of open journalism, has also elaborated a very strong guideline or code called the Community Standards and Participation Guidelines. So, insofar as one is wanting, if you do want, and whoever the we is, to generate some sort of code of practice or code of ethics, there are some quite reasonable starting places, only starting places, where one could start. The key questions, I think, here in relation to this topic are the two which I itemize at point 4. Does the integration of UGC, that's of course user-generated content, into output, does it cause any particular issues for news organizations? Now, that may seem too partial, that may seem too one-sided. I mean, does it cause any particular issues for news organizations and, not quite yet, thank you, and the uploaders? Thank you. but it's put like that, and I'm an academic, so I'll give you my source for where I've drawn that question from. And also the second one, what are those issues and how do they handle them? And in the latter part of the presentation, so if you could scroll up now to point 5, please, so that point 5 comes to the top. Thank you so much. You will see at the bottom there a URL to a very recently published research report, which I think is pretty useful. It's published by an organization which some of you may have heard of called the Tau Center. I think that's at New York University, Geneva. Am I right in that? The Tau.
This one came from Columbia.
Did it? But is Tau part of Columbia?
Tau Center
is part
at Columbia,
of Columbia.
And there's a Tau Night at CUNY.
Right, but this came out of Columbia,
yeah.
right? Thank you so much. And it's, I think, a very interesting research publication called Amateur Footage, a global study of user-generated content in TV and online news output. And their overall conclusion is that news managers need to understand the full implications of integrating UGC and to do so quickly. And we say this particularly with regard to the impact on their staff, their audiences, and the people who are creating the content in the first place. So you have a kind of tripart, group of stakeholders here. There's the staff of the sort of more traditional or the offline news and online news media organizations. You have the audience to whom they are speaking. And I'll come to that in a moment in terms of do they know, do they understand which bits of the output is UGC or not? And finally, there is the implications for the UGC providers themselves, the hundreds and thousands and maybe more of what are called citizen journalists or more pejoratively ordinary people who are, even as we are speaking, sending in droves items to places like the BBC and other established news organizations every day. So the source of that is that study, which was, I think, published only a few months ago. I think it's quite valuable in terms of its methodology, in terms of its questions. And let me just conclude, Geneva, by just going through one or two of the key issues which they itemize, which I think are ethical/professional and therefore would need to be sort of considered in any effort to try and elaborate any kind of code of ethics or self-regulatory scheme or whatever. And I'm not going to go down them from A to F. I've got this bizarre quirk of liking to work from the back to the front. So it's just a quirk. There's nothing principled about it or particularly effective. It's just me. And so we'll start with F, which I think is quite important in terms of something that our friend here said, the other legacy journalist, who I think is perhaps not with us at the moment. But one of their points is the need to establish clarity in articulating to people on the ground about how to stay safe and what sort of conditions they will not use content that has been captured, particularly by people who have put themselves into danger or who are committing illegal acts. And that issue of putting yourself into danger was one that was very forcefully addressed by our other legacy colleague this morning. And so that's an interesting aspect of I think, any potential sort of, group of ethical standards. Make it clear that you're not going to use content if in getting it, somebody has arbitrarily or recklessly put themselves in harm's way or in danger's way or possibly illegal. For example, as some of you in the room will know, I'm very interested at the moment on the issue of using drones. That is remotely piloted aircraft. I told you, Nonny, I would get it in at every presentation. Drones for the purposes, not listening to, the purposes of news gathering and journalism. Now, currently, if you use one of these things and try to sell the data that you capture, it would be deemed by the local civil aviation authority as being used for commercial purposes, and there are many countries, including the United States, where that would be regarded as unlawful. So supposing you get a good image taken by a remotely piloted aircraft, taken in circumstances where either the operator and perhaps everyone else ought to have known it's illegal, Does the news media organization nonetheless use it? So that's an example of where you might have an illegal use of information. So that's the last one. I'm coming very quickly to a conclusion. The E is also, I think, quite interesting. This report points to an academic study about to be published in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, which is going to compare self-reported psychological impacts of journalists who are working on normal domestic desks from people that I know, and you may well know too, who work in UGC content units. Because the images that the UGC content workers have to confront are horrific. They are pictures of butchered bodies or mutilated bodies, which are regarded as, which may come from something as unfortunately banal as a traffic accident to, the execution of someone in any number of countries that we can dream up. So there is a sort of health and safety at work implication of a user-generated content unit where the issues of, as the study says, the exposure to UGC content consistently predicts multiple indices of psychopathology, anxiety, depression, PTSD, or alcohol consumption. Now,